The fact that no country on the African continent, for instance, forms part of that just looks like economic injustice. And we've engaged TikTok on this anomaly, right? And including up to the highest level in the form of their vice president. And credit also even to the content creators that reached out to me, because I wasn't aware of this issue. To respond to is not about being pro or being anti an individual or any particular company. I am pro expanding broadband connectivity to as many millions of South Africans as possible.
When it comes to, for instance, my card disc just recently expired, right? And me being a Gen Z tech enthusiast, I wishes that I could just log into a certain website, takes my ID credentials and all my credentials personally as a South African citizen in order to renew my disc.
Between 23 to 25.1 million South Africans at any given stage as we speak, they don't have access to broadband connectivity. And if we don't work as aggressively as we should in order to expand broadband connectivity to those people.
The topic of the cost of data, and I don't know how you kind of your department working alongside, other corporates or the private sector to kind of mitigate this concern of, expensive data costs, and so that regular South Africans are able to connect to the internet as much as we can.
Access to data can be a powerful instrument to use for diplomacy or even for manipulation. So that is why the independent location of state data is important, that it is guarded to remain within the boundaries of the country. The ultimate goal is to remove the ad valorem checks on smart devices, because unlike 30 years ago, unlike 20 years ago, or even a decade ago, these devices are not luxury right now. They've become a basic tool in the digital space that we live in to communicate. So as a result, the very first breakthrough that we had was...
Welcome back to yet another exciting and very important episode of Cyber Digest, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have, as always, a very important guest, but I think today you really want to lock in if you want to understand the future of South Africa and Africa at large in terms of technology and everything around us. Before I introduce our guest, my name is Khotso Mashiane and I'm here with my co-hosts.
Welcome back for another episode of Cyber Digest. Kamalam is Wandile Dube, where we essentially decode the digital matrix. And of course, like Khoto said, we have a very important guest in the studio. But of course, I'm with my co-host.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome to yet another episode of Cyber Digest, where we decode the digital matrix. And as my fellow co-hosts have mentioned, we've got a very important and special guest today, Mr. Solly Malatsi. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very well. I've never been made to feel more important than in the last 45 seconds. Each one of you rubber stamped it. I've got an important job. I don't know whether I'm important, but I've got an important job and I don't take it lightly. So it's a pleasure to join you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're gonna have for the next hour or so.
Thank you. So if you guys don't know yet, Minister Solly is the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies in South Africa. And my first question for you, sir, is you are the first in this role, Minister, as part of a GNU. So we just want to get like a rough overview of what that looks like, between two parties managing this kind of role and carrying this kind of weight.
Look, I think, it's a special responsibility because our country at the formation of the GNU, and it still is at a very interesting transition from one party state control to now having 10 parties governing together, because that's what the electorate imposed, and what that imposes, particularly on the new cohort of ministers and deputy ministers, is that there's got to be much more cooperation even with your political opponents, because no one has absolute control throughout the government. So it does have its own challenges in that way, because it means that in order to get progress, there is a lot of horse trading. There's a lot of negotiation that goes on, but ultimately, I mean, whether it's a government through a coalition or not, the full powers of the minister are still the same, right? The buck ultimately stops there, and that's what makes it exciting, because we've got a responsibility to lead our country through a very special moment in history, and I think any forecast and projection in terms of the future of government in South Africa shows that for the foreseeable future, coalitions are going to be the form of government going forward. So we better make this work collectively, because the predictions is that even as you go into next year's local government elections, the metros and more municipalities will likely fall into a form of coalition that would require people who have for a long period been on opposing sides of political issues and even political ideas to find a way of working together for what is in the best interest of the country, in this case of what is in the best interest of those municipalities, because they are at the interface, at the core phase of people's daily experiences in the communities where people are.
That's very powerful, and I think you've kind of highlighted the importance of just unity in general, and also collaboration. And so we've had various guests from different, walks of life. We had Mpho, who's he runs the geek culture movement, and we've had Mr. Eric, who's a game designer, a local game studio within South Africa. And so that's why I wanted to know, how do you see the government's role evolving from just a regulator to an enabler of innovation within the tech space?
Look, government has multiple roles, right? But the most important aspect is it's gotta use its regulatory powers, which is in the form of policy making, to create an environment that can enable the sector to drive. And the digital technology and communication space is so broad, because from telecommunications, broadcasting, postal services, innovation, we're now talking about AI, we're talking about competition in the market, and ultimately innovation. So the approach, and at least my approach, is that we have to look at what is the capacity of the state to begin with. Right? And there are things that the state cannot do well, and there are the things that the state can do well. And we have to focus on those that we can do well. And those that we can do well is to be able to ensure that through the powers that we have in policy making, we create fair policies, right? We enhance access to connectivity and to technology and to new technologies. And making sure that the cost to communicate is affordable given the state of our economy. And secondly, to ensure that we don't, in our quest to ensure that the laws of the country are upheld, stifle innovation. Because this is the hub of creativity, right? And for sectors like these to thrive, there has to be freedom within innovation to be able to think about new designs, think about new solutions, think about new ways of consuming information, or new areas of entertainment, be it in gaming or in coding. That will also spark entrepreneurship, because we have to be mindful of the fact that the government is in no capacity to create jobs that our economy needs, right? So what it needs to do is to create an enabling environment that obviously will support, the jobs that exist, but also ensure that it can spark new entrepreneurs and new job creators that can emerge in the space in order to accommodate the millions of young people that are emerging. And that is why, for me, it's important to pursue digital skills amongst young people, but even so amongst the entirety of the population, because digital skills are not just social currency, they're just a powerful currency in the digital economy. And by any projection, we know based on global trends and even an assessment of the state of our country's economy where it is, that the digital economy is going to be a major contributor towards our country's GDP, and that contribution is going to exponentially increase even in the next few years. So we have to then look at ways of making the digital economy to thrive.
That's beautiful. So while we're on that collaboration conversation, are there any strategic partnerships that you guys are currently looking at, or that you guys are currently part of with any of the private sector companies who are in tech and AI, maybe from education perspective and also a development perspective?
No, absolutely. So we work with the sector. I mean, from your Microsoft in terms of, some of the work that we are doing, particularly around digital skills and AI in particular, as we are finalizing our AI policy. We've just gone through an extensive consultation process, and by our projection is that we'll take it through the cabinet process so that policy is finalized in the first quarter of next year. And we work very closely with the private sector, because here's the thing, right? The reality is that for the solutions that we need in our sector, the expertise lies both within government and the private sector. So the partnerships and pursuing those partnerships is actually such an essential ingredient in our quest for success in this area.
Minister, I think in the beginning, before my co-host had asked you a question, you touched on something actually quite important, and it was round about accessibility. And, a week ago we had a guest, Eric, and he touched on something profound. He said, Africa's biggest challenge isn't, some of these shiny new toys, these technologies like VR and AR and AI. It's, these devices, it's accessibility, it's laptops, it's mobile phones. And so, accessibility is not just about connection, internet, it's also about the hardware and its affordability. And so I want to know, what are we currently doing right now to kind of, make sure that, as things like AI and VR and all of these new technologies come along, that, we are also moving in those directions in a very equitable way, where even people without access to a lot of these devices, they gain access to these technologies, but also the devices. So what are we doing to kind of mitigate, those concerns?
And I'm glad you asked that question, because it's one of my primary focus areas. Because truth be told, connectivity alone is insufficient to get more people to be active in the digital space. And what is the first instrument that people, need in order to be connected, right? Over and above broadband connectivity is the devices. When you look in terms of just the cost of devices, there is no doubt that for the average low-income household in South Africa, affording any of these devices that you guys are using here is a pipe dream for them. So one of the things that I approached since taking office was to look at what are some of the policy decisions that make the cost of devices to be as unaffordable as they are. And we discovered, which is something that I think any person in the space knows, that smart devices have an additional tax called the ad valorem tax, right? Because they are considered a luxury good. And that is why they've got the ad valorem tax. And that percentage, I think it's 9%, which obviously drives the cost of those devices. And we started engaging with Treasury about the possibility of reviewing that luxury tax. And the ultimate goal is to remove the ad valorem tax on smart devices, because unlike 30 years ago, unlike 20 years ago, or even a decade ago, these devices are not luxury right now. They've become a basic tool in the digital space that we live in to communicate. So as a result, the very first breakthrough that we had was for devices below 2,500, I think. Though the ad valorem tax has been removed just as the first step. And that represents a major breakthrough, because for low income household, being able to get a 4G device under 2,500, that will widen access in that area, and we're going to be incrementally looking at this. Of course, there are those smart devices, certain brands that, by virtue of their design and their
brand equity
components, yes, they will have a particular cost, but we are looking at widening the door for access for low income households, so that we can tap into the wealth of that part of our population, which we know. And this is linked to something profound. A quarter of South Africa's population doesn't have access to broadband connectivity, right? That means what? Roughly between 23 to 25.1 million South Africans at any given stage as we speak, they don't have access to broadband connectivity. And if we don't work as aggressively as we should in order to expand broadband connectivity to those people, what we are going to do is to leave millions of dreamers, millions of potential innovators, tech entrepreneurs, and some of the people who could be spearheading some of the groundbreaking solutions that would even help government deal with service delivery much more efficiently, much more quicker, and much more robustly than we're currently doing.
On the question of connectivity and accessibility, we know that Elon Musk is pushing very hard to introduce Starlink into South Africa. And it's said, or he's rather said, that if it is brought to South Africa, a lot more of the population will have access to, the internet, basic internet. So I just want to understand the security implications of introducing this kind of technology into the country, and how you guys are moving forward with that. Are you pro Starlink? Are you against Starlink? What's the future of South Africa looking like with the relationship with Elon Musk?
I mean, the right question, to respond to is not about being pro or being anti an individual or any particular company. I am pro expanding broadband connectivity to as many millions of South Africans as possible. I come from a village, right? And there are even parts of my village where you can't get broadband connectivity anyway. So my focus is those 23 million South Africans who wake up every day without broadband connectivity. And where are the solutions going to come from? The solutions are going to come from multiple sources. It's going to be, fiber. And we live in an age wherein we can't ignore the fact that new technologies such as low orbit Earth satellites are instrumental in providing broadband connectivity. The second point to make is, in doing so, we have to do that within the current rules that exist in our country, right? The third point to make is, we have to also then look within our rules, what are some of the bottlenecks that, if we dealt with, can help us get to connect as many people as possible in our country and find the solution in that area. And then to come back to the question that I think you're trying to get to, is that in our country, we've got the regulator, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, which is called ICASA. So if you or the podcast wants to obtain an individual or class license, you have to apply to ICASA, right? So the current rules then state that for international or multinational companies who need to obtain a telecommunications license, ought to sell 30% of their company to local South Africans in order to apply for a license, because making an application does not guarantee that the license will be granted. It must still be assessed by the independent regulator. So that is the current architecture of what the rule says. And that is where we are now. So what I've done is to introduce a policy directive that then said to ICASA, okay, let us look at widening the scope of granting telecommunications licenses in the country by looking at the possibility of what are called equity equivalent investment program. And this means, and it's part of our broad-based block economic empowerment rules, right? Because if you look at IBM, if you look at Microsoft, for instance, and you go even outside the sector, you go into motoring and mining, for instance, you'll find that BMW operates in South Africa, but it did not sell 30% of its, shareholding to local South Africans, because they were able to pursue the avenue of equity equivalent programs, which is provided for in law. The unique element is that when you come to the issuing of telecommunications licenses, in 2021, ICASA introduced a regulation that said exclusively when dealing with matters of issuing telecommunication license, you must sell 30% of your shareholding to local South Africans if you're an international company. So we are looking at aligning the laws so that there is consistency, and that process is currently underway. For me, what matters the most is there's gotta be fairness in making sure that we apply the rules consistently towards any player in the space. There's gotta be open-mindedness, right, with regards to the realization that in order to get South Africa to above 90% broadband connectivity, we have to look at where the solutions are. And the solutions means that we must pursue every possibility within the law, because it's important to keep underscoring that in order to get to, whether you are from KZN or the Eastern Cape, Mtuba, that you have the same quality of connectivity as you would right here, right? Because we know the value of having access to broadband connectivity and what it does in terms of uplifting people out of poverty towards a meaningful economic activity, because we know that it will not only drive traffic, but empower more people, younger people, to study online. It will empower entrepreneurs to be able to reach bigger and broader markets beyond the boundaries of their immediate space, and it will be able to spur new areas and even new industries that will merge and be the driving force behind job creation and the inclusive growth which the GNU was established to pursue.
Now, Minister, if I may, because I think you've kind of touched on something important, and that's the importance of policy. And so I wanted you to kind of just break down the Mpho, because there's been a lot of misconceptions, especially with regards to Starlink and just foreign investment and South Africa. And I kind of wanted you to just kind of break down the importance of why if you have a country who wants to get a telecommunications license within South Africa, why it's important that they kind of comply with say triple BEE policies, and why these frameworks are actually important within the context of communications and digital technologies.
Look, there are laws in the country, right? And we have to consistently apply the laws as they exist and always look at how do we improve the current laws that we have to sort out the problems that we face. South Africa is confronted with a major problem now, which is the fact that you've got 23 million South Africans who are not digitally connected because they're outside the boundaries of broadband connectivity. And what is the assessment? There is even acknowledgement by the telecommunications companies that, they are constrained from investing in some of the most remote areas where many of these communities are and live, because when you look at the viability of commercial investments in there, it may not be up to the scale at which they are forecasting, right? So in that area, then it shows that there is the need for other solutions, which include new technologies like those satellites. For me, it matters less where the satellite solution comes from, whether it comes from, Middle East, whether it comes from Scandinavia, Europe, or the US. We have to look at within the laws of our country, compliance with the existing laws of our country and all our laws, because there is also often a narrative to elevate some laws over others where they should be complied with. And it's important to make this point, which I should have made in response to the previous question, in just expanding on what equity equivalent program means, right? Because it basically means that as a potential multinational investor into South Africa, you have the option, which is codified in law in terms of the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act amendment, which was done, that if you do not want to, for whatever reason, right, sell 30% of your local company, 30% of your shares to your local company, your local resident, you can pursue the equity equivalent program avenue. That sets out specific conditions, and those conditions include investing in job creation, which is non-negotiable, right? An investment in having commercial relations with local suppliers and local service providers, investing in research and development, and depending on the sector, doing interventions towards addressing the need in those sectors. And that's why the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition has what are called sector codes. So the sector codes stipulate in each and very specific sector the compliance areas that companies need to fulfill. In our case, those would be the ICT sector codes, and they would stipulate that you have to invest a particular quantum, for instance, towards broadband connectivity or digital skills, or cyber labs, or invest this much in supporting postgraduate learning. And this means that at a broader level, you are going to be touching much more lives and more South Africans than if you were to sell 30% of your business to the three musketeers on the podcast.
Minister, what I wanted to ask is, how is the government planning on incorporating tech and AI when it comes to service delivery, right? And specifically when it comes to, for instance, my card disk just recently expired, right? And me being a Gen Z tech enthusiast, I wishes that I could just log into a certain website, takes my ID credentials and all my credentials personally as a South African citizen in order to renew my disk, right? And then this also goes to probably even solving the whole Home Affairs issue of system always being down. Now, my question is, what are the constraints or bottlenecks that could be maybe stopping that advancement from happening? Because you also mentioned that broadband connectivity could possibly one of them.
In fairness, and that question excites me because there's some really good work that is going to solve specifically the problems that you have. So Home Affairs has embarked on this concept of, Home Affairs at home, right? Which means that being able to, from the comfort of wherever you are, having access directly to Home Affairs. And they've established a series of partnerships with banks where you can walk into your, any of your reputable banks branches and apply for your smart ID and including your passport. And Minister Schreiber has done an incredible job, even just from the turnaround time and improving overall customer experience in that area. And then when you come back, in terms of the work that is being done through the digital transformation roadmap. In March this year, South Africa launched, the digital public infrastructure identity. So there's this concept of the My Mzansi app, which will be launching because there is work that is going underway, which will be a centralized system where you can aggregate all government services and through the individualized personal credentials you'll be able to access. And from there on, whether it's your, you'll access all the government services aggregated in that area. You'll have your own, or digital ID that will enable you to renew your even TV license should be incorporated in there, but to renew your motor vehicle license, and though that will be zero rated, right? Because the important thing about it is to drive usage of that, so that people are not excluded from getting into the MyMzansi app because they can afford to have data.
That I'm excited for.
The new digital transformation roadmap, it promises a one person, one government, one tax system. And I want to know, for a person who's living in, in a rural area, like, let's say in a village from Limpopo, what does that practically mean for them?
So it practically means that using your digital credentials, you'll be able to access a portal that has links to a variety of government services, linked obviously to your identity, and that centralized space means that you've cut down the cost of travel to your SASSA offices for queries on your social grant, motor vehicle, to the traffic department on this, UIF accessibility, for instance, even home affairs. And of course, because, this is in the development stage, it means that there will be trials and errors along that journey. But the ideal is that through one touch, you are able to then access this bouquet of government services at your disposal at no cost.
That's powerful. And I think it's kind of tackling the issue that, that's plagued us as a country for a long time, which is the digital divide. And I want to know, what have been the challenges, especially, since, you've taken on your role with kind of addressing key issues within this larger umbrella issue, which is the digital divide within South Africa?
Yeah, look, and I think it's important to contextualize that, because sometimes we speak of these things as if they are intangible, and they can become cliches and buzzwords. The reality is that the digital divide represents, two sets of populations, right? One that has the means to enjoy all the advantages that reliable and meaningful broadband connectivity offers in modern day life. And then you've got another part of our population, as I said, a quarter of our population, who do not interface with that. And that means on a daily basis, people are cheated of the power to connect with the world outside their immediate boundaries. And that, for me, is the greatest injustice of our time. And what has been some of, the letdown is government has initiated a very noble program called the SA Connect program, which, when it was conceptualized, was primarily to connect, government buildings, because we know that a lot of those are closer to communities, right? To connect hospitals, police stations, and also install, free public Wi-Fi spots across many indigent communities in order to drive connectivity in those areas. The sad part about that is the project has historically not been managed well at the from our department, quite frankly, to make sure that we get to as many of those communities as possible. And I think in this day and age, quite frankly, it's embarrassing that there are schools that do not have broadband connectivity. So one of the conditions for licenses for telecommunications, which was imposed as a result of the spectrum that was sold by the Independent Communications Authority, was that the mobile network operators, your Vodacoms, Telecoms, Cell C, and MTN, as part of their license conditions, they must connect a certain number of schools as part of their contribution, right? Can you believe that it took approximately a year for the Department of Basic Education in the 6th administration to get to the stage where it, agrees with giving permission to access to schools so that those schools can be connected? And something as small as that has major implications on the ability of connecting people to the digital world. So those are some of the administrative challenges that have stood in the way of something as noble as this having the impact that it ought to have in society. But I'm very glad that in the 7th administration, my department and basic education, working together with the mobile network operators, we've managed to have a breakthrough so that all those issues are resolved and we can get as many schools as possible connected to the internet.
Minister, on a lighter note, I just wanted to ask, is there any piece of technology that you've recently came across, whether locally or globally, that made you feel inspired and think that, okay, this is the future?
I mean, look, I meet incredible people in the space and the number of solutions that come into place. I forgot these guys, but basically they've developed an app, right, which enables the ability to do medical diagnosis without doing a visit to the doctor. And the power of that is to be able to link patients or would-be patients with a medical expert that can do a visual diagnosis and then be able to guide them properly in terms of what medication to get. And as someone who comes from a village and still lives there, I mean, it's powerful because poor communities and low-income households have to constantly, on a daily basis, make the choice between putting food on the table and addressing any
critical
other,
issues.
socio-economic issue that they are grappling with.
The National AI Plan came out not too long ago, and you've previously spoken about, building South African AI for South Africans. Can you sort of paint a practical picture of what that process has been looking like and what it will continue to look like? And if I'm a young researcher or academic in South Africa, how could I contribute to that plan?
Yeah, and I wish we had had the conversation when it was still open for public comments, because the public consultation phase is one of the most beautiful and powerful designs of our democracy that enables citizens to play a proactive role in influencing and shaping policy making in the space. So that process concluded. And we are now doing what is called the stakeholder engagement, which is to engage key stakeholders in society based on the feedback that we got in order to refine the final policy. And as I said earlier, what we'll then do after incorporation of those is to present it to cabinet so that it is formally adopted as the country's national AI policy. It is still a draft AI policy at this stage, but there's been a lot of contributions from even academia, business, and even ordinary South Africans in terms of their submissions in there. I think the concept around AI for South Africa is that we are a very diverse country, right? So one of the key things that we have to look at is even in the language models of AI, to look at the diversity of our country and incorporate that, so that whether you are isiZulu speaking or Xitsonga speaking, right? Those are able to be incorporated and reflected in there, because part of the digital inclusion that you spoke about means that even these new technologies have to be inclusive in their design and in their functionality. And that's one of the things that we're doing, but also to ensure that, they are human-centered, because in as much as there are the advantages of AI, which we all want to leverage, we have to look at minimizing or eliminating as much as possible the potential risks around manipulation, right? Around data manipulation, around generative AI manipulation that can lead to deep fakes and leading into misinformation and disinformation, because information integrity is very, very important in this sphere of effective design of data.
Now,
AI.
Minister, I think you touched on something there, and I think it's kind of also the idea of digital gold, and that's our data, the importance of our data, and in the national data and cloud policy, there's something that is described as data sovereignty. I think it would be great if you can just unpack that for us, what it means, especially as we get so many foreign companies investing in South Africa. You've got Google, you've got Microsoft, but at the end of the day, it's important that we own the talent, we own the data. And so, if you can also just unpack the importance of data sovereignty.
I think you've answered it. I mean, data sovereignty is about ensuring that local data remains within the borders of the country and that it is protected from any external manipulation that could potentially be used for nefarious purposes, because we know data is lucrative. Data is power. And in the world of constantly shifting geopolitics, access to data can be a powerful instrument to use for diplomacy or even for manipulation. So that is why the independent location of state data is important, that it is guarded to remain within the boundaries of the country.
So the national data and cloud policy, like how does it specifically protect citizens from foreign companies from accessing this data and manipulating it? How does it protect us?
Yeah. So the ultimate goal, is to ensure that there is no violation to the integrity of state and national data, right? And I think there are other instruments that are already in existence in terms of the protection of individual and personal information, one of which is the POPIA Act, for instance, right? And this should be seen in conjunction with each other. But it is ultimately to ensure that we build the board rails that protect any potential infringement towards individual or government data from sources that shouldn't have access to those information. And if they have access to those information by design of contractual service provision that is done with government, that it is shielded to remain within the borders of our country.
Nice. So beyond policy making and the policy documents, what does, in your point, from your point of view, what does a successful take an AI driven South Africa look like maybe in the next 10 years? 2035, and where do you see us kind of establishing a competitive global advantage?
Look, I think in terms of establishing a competitive career advantage there, you'll be surprised to find out that, some of the most influential scholars and even researchers in AI development come from South Africa. There's, Prof. Chizi Marwala, for instance, Prof. Marivate at the University of Pretoria. These are renowned South African scholars that are held in esteem globally in terms of the work that they are doing in shaping and influencing AI development. But I think ultimately for me, it's going to be how, one, as government, we embrace the use of AI into boosting our efforts to bring services much more closer to people and improve citizens' general experience with interacting with government online. You made the point earlier about systems being off and all of that, and it's kind of like become a a South African idiom, right?
Sure.
That any interface with government services online, the system is off.
Sure.
Right? We need to move into an era where that is removed from our lexicon, but it can only be removed from our lexicon through that improved quality of service online that we have. And I think even in embracing that into education, and our education curriculum at the very foundational level, including even primary education, because the reality is we can't escape from the influence of technology. What we ought to be doing is to constantly be vigilant, alert to how we influence its use towards positive outcomes.
Love that.
Within the government, I think most of the solutions that we've discussed today are for South Africans, which obviously is the main goal. But the powerhouse of the country is the government. How are you guys within government institutions future-proofing, all the records that we've had over time? I mean, when you go to most places, Stats SA, for example, most of the records are still kept on physical paper. So how are you guys working on future-proofing all of this documentation to essentially help us continue moving forward within the government?
Yeah, and I think that's where as government, the elementary steps are being taken. I mean, you make the example, for instance, of Stats SA, but then I can easily make the point about the advances that SARS has made, for instance, into fully embracing technology, to the extent that it automatically generates your tax assessment for certain income thresholds, and then provides it to you. It doesn't now manually wait for you to go into a branch and do that. So that just shows glimmers of hope, right, in several government departments. But the key thing, which is what the Mzansi One Government, One Touch is going to do, is to make sure that there aren't just glimpses of hope, but the whole ecosystem of government when it comes to digital communications represents the times and era that we live in, so that through that one touch you are able to access a variety of government services, and through the quality of connectivity, you are not stuck on one hyperlink or website for an inordinate amount of time trying to access something as simple as renewing your motor vehicle license, as is the case with them.
Now, Minister, I want to take us back just a bit, and it's talking about access and connectivity, and I think this has been a common thing within South Africa for years now, and the topic of the cost of data, and I don't know how you kind of your department working alongside other corporates or the private sector to kind of mitigate this concern of expensive data costs, and so that regular South Africans are able to connect to the internet as much as we can.
No, absolutely. And as I said in the beginning, I don't think you'll meet any sane South African who would, hold the view that the cost to communicate in South Africa is affordable. It is extremely expensive, to get access to data, for instance. And I think in the conversation, we need to properly identify and dissect what the real causes and the problems of that are, because the temptation can often be to respond with populist interventions, right? That may get us applauses, but in reality are not grounded on the scientific assessment of what the problems are. And I think this is where it becomes very, very important for everyone to play a role, because as government, for instance, government can't regulate the price of data. That is just the law of the country, right? You've got the Independent Communications Authority, which can set a series of interventions to influence the cost to communicate and driving down those costs. And I think what's going to be very, very, very important in getting South Africa to affordable data costs is one, looking at broadening their solutions to access to broadband connectivity. Because if there is a singular reliance, for instance, on mobile network operators to provide, the service, then the conversation is always gonna be, okay, cool. Is the market too consolidated to then drive costs in this way? Or another school of thought may argue that you need more market competition in order to drive the cost down. But when you look at trends that are emerging globally, is that in many of the markets, I mean, you are left with less than 3, or in some instances even 2 major mobile network operators in some of the markets, because it's a very, very difficult space to survive and have longevity and sustainability. But I think there's gotta be a broader recognition in terms of where the state of our economy is, and the price modeling has to take into consideration that.
Minister, last question from my end. Like, I think the vision that you have and you undertaking such difficult challenges, especially when it comes to the digital sector, it's pretty applaudable and phenomenal. What kind of inspires you to want to carry on, to want to bring the change that South Africa needs from a digital perspective?
I mean, it's as simple as the mere fact that I can wake up in Pretoria or Cape Town by virtue of the benefits of my work and have world-class connectivity. But when I go back to my village, to my own house, it's a struggle, right? And I don't face that struggle every day, but there are 23 million South Africans who wake up every day. There are people who have to climb on the roofs of their houses to just get signal for connectivity. There are people who have to, walk miles to the nearest Wi-Fi hotspot in order to get to some form of connectivity. My daily inspiration is trying to make sure that that struggle does not exist in my lifetime, or for as long as I am in this role, because the wealth of opportunities that something as simple yet profound as access to broadband connectivity does in enabling a quality of life is immense. And the reality that there are some people who don't have a taste of that is what keeps me awake at night.
Minister, I wanna talk about arguably our nation's greatest resource, and that's our young innovative talent. And so I wanted to know, especially with things like remote work, what are kind of the plans to kind of nurture and retain our talent and kind of create this talent ecosystem where we're not essentially experiencing a brain drain, and where these other countries essentially just take so much of our talent. What are the plans to kind of create an environment where these young innovative talent stay in South Africa and they innovate within the borders of South Africa and essentially change our country?
Innovation has no boundaries, and I think we ought to be pragmatic in the sense that we don't view people's aspirations to interact or pursue opportunities in a global and international space as taking away from what we have, because that influence can continue to be greater. But I think what's important to underscore is the nature of work, right, as we know it, has changed. Whether imposed on us by COVID or technology, the reality is you can achieve the same level of efficiency and productivity working from your studio apartment, as you would if you were in your cubicle in your office, right? And for others that may be the case, right? So I think it's about one, changing the culture of work even within government and being much more accommodative to results orientation. And secondly, in terms of innovation, which is where I think you're trying to grow, is keeping talent in South Africa. I don't think we should be restrictive that way, because what it does when talent goes into additional markets, it attracts more talent, it attracts more curiosity about where this talent is from, and it attracts investment into nurturing more and more of those talent. But I think what's equally important is the creation of sufficient opportunities locally, so that we are not sitting with frustrated talents that then think the only way to obtain success, whether it's in the digital space, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in law, you need to get out of South Africa and go elsewhere.
On Cyber Digest, we have a primarily Gen Z audience that watches the podcast. What tech skills would you recommend to that young audience that they should possibly go out and learn or venture into to prepare them for the next 5 to 10 years in the country and globally? Because we understand that technology it moves at a rapid speed. So 5 years within the tech industry is almost 15 years in real time.
I mean, I think your audience can teach me more about that than me doing that. But on a serious note, look, I think technology is constantly evolving, right? But when you look in terms of new industries, new careers that are emerging, I think, the ability to navigate AI, is always going to be a powerful instrument for any human being, actually, who just wants to be efficient and be effective and productive. I think, issues, particularly for the younger people, to take up coding and robotics as early as possible. I think in terms of spurring innovation, it becomes very, very important. And quite frankly, I mean, in this field, there are lucrative careers, guys, from, designing, from cybersecurity, from software engineering. Those are always going to be, the areas that require, more talent to get into those spaces, because this industry, technology is going to be the bedrock, if it's not already is the bedrock of all the other industries in the economy, right? But it also means that one has to constantly upskill.
And do you guys have opportunities at the moment that maybe we could go out and apply towards, working towards within any kind of government institution or in the private sector even?
No, absolutely. So I mean, and with us, there are very basic, opportunities, because, government led program for 3 weeks up to 6 weeks won't give you the same, skills and expertise as you would if you were, pursuing, a degree or diploma in robotics designing, right? But there are very basic, digital skills and programs that we're doing together with our partners. We've got an entity, so I'll explain this. So an entity means a part of a government department that is responsible for skills trainings, called NEMISA, that does constant training and offers a series of opportunities in this field. I mean, even at the department level, we're working with, as I mentioned, Microsoft earlier. There are programs that we are doing with Huawei, which are available on our websites, that young people can look in terms of upskilling themselves and, even taking on new skills.
Now, Minister, I wanted to ask you about something, and it's, you made a comment about it earlier in the year, and it was earlier in the year. You spoke about the need for companies like TikTok to pay African creators, and we're a nation, a continent that drives a lot of traffic in TikTok. We're very charismatic, we're very talented, and so I wanted you to just kind of expand on that view. And are there any initiatives right now within government to kind of address this issue where companies like TikTok's rightfully pay African creators?
Yeah, I mean that issue for me, and credit to my team, because I wasn't as active on TikTok as I was before. And my team, in part of doing their work, they were like, there's an anomaly in the sense that TikTok has this thing called the Creators Fund, right? But it is only applicable in 6 countries, I think. I think it's China, the US, UK, Brazil, and 2 others that I can't remember now. And no country on the African market has access to that Creators Fund. And my instant reaction to that was, well, if you look at the size of the South African market in TikTok, over and beyond its influence, and the fact that no country on the African continent, for instance, forms part of that, just looks like economic injustice. And we've engaged TikTok on this anomaly, right? And including up to the highest level, in the form of their vice president. And credit also even to the content creators that reached out to me, because I wasn't aware of this issue. And we haven't had the breakthrough as yet. But it's a fight that we are going to constantly fight on behalf of the South African content creators, because we understand full well that the future of work and entrepreneurship has changed completely to what it was, right? And secondly, is that there has to be parity and fairness in terms of rewarding and opportunities that exist in other markets, right? And we strongly believe South Africa for TikTok is such a big and strong market that any program of benefits towards content creators that it has in any other parts of the market, it's a travesty of justice that it doesn't exist in South Africa.
Minister, we'd just like to thank you. I don't think any of us have any more questions.
Spotlight.
Yes. So on Cyber Digest, we do have something. I think Romeo touched on it a bit earlier on. But is there one tech product, hardware or software, that you're currently enjoying that's maybe making your life a lot easier, and maybe most people don't know about that product?
Nah, what makes my life easier is my phone, man.
Plain and simple.
I don't want to sound too fancy.
Sure.
That's the reality.
No, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that was Minister Malatsi. Thank you so much for for coming through, sir, actually.
Thank you. You
Giving
guys
us your
look
time.
far more serious than you were during the interview.
Thanks so much.
Gotta represent.
All right, guys, that's it from us, and we hope to see you again. Signing out.
Yes, sir, Ski. Don't forget to like,
share,
subscribe,
comment,
tell your mom,
tell
your
mom's
mother's
mom.
mother, everyone in your family.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.
Signing out.